So, welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today I'd like to talk about the rise and fall of human rights culture as part of the end of global liberalism. Now, we already talked a little bit in my History of Liberalism video about the rise of rights theory under Locke. But one of the things which happened following the Cold War again was that this sort of triumphalism of liberalism led to some shifts in how we looked at cultural diversity and rights, which has ultimately undermined the ability to spread or work together. I'm going to backtrack on that a little bit. It's ultimately undermined the ability to work together on building a collective human rights framework, primarily because the United States tends to see itself as the pinnacle of rights theory and therefore gets to define human rights for the rest of the world. Now, this leads to very big problems when it comes to human rights organizations like Amnesty International. And this leads to a increasing amount of resistance around the world. And in fact, human rights culture kind of was the first piece of this global liberalism to kind of begin to fail in big ways. So, if we get back to sort of the basic premise of human rights theory, it's that you have a Hobbesian state. The state has an obligation to protect people from bad things, but because the state's so powerful, we need individual rights to counterbalance the state and limit it in some way, shape, or form. The next issue is that as this goes into popular view and you go from some concept of natural rights in a Hobbesian state to general ideas of rights more generally, there's no real epistemological basis for a right. In other words, rights are things that people hold as self-evident. They're not things that we can hold disagreements with about over normal conversation and figure out who's right or who's wrong, because there's no objective basis for them. So what you end up with is a document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is very vaguely worded, and outlines a set of shared aspirations. Now, those shared aspirations then can be a basis for coming together and further building on or defining this document, right? But instead, what we saw starting in the 1990s was an idea that certain human rights groups saw a necessity to carry on a sort of culture war over the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we saw this first with the idea from largely Protestant countries that sexual individualism itself was a human right. Okay? And this rose in the 1990s. And, I talked with a number of human rights advocates at that time, and they were split between two groups. You had, on one hand, the Marxists who basically said, people I know say, yeah, we have disagreements here, but let's still work on other things. The liberals I knew basically said, we're right, you're wrong. But there's no way of proving that, right? So it just becomes a struggle. And the idea is that might makes right, and we're the most powerful country in the world, so we got to tell everybody what their rights are. Needless to say, most of the world doesn't like that, right? And especially when you talk about sexual individualism, what you have to understand is that family as a social order is very closely tied to sexuality in the social order, right? So, rules that govern sexuality in a culture often are closely tied to family structures and family aspirations. Additionally, in much of the world, the family isn't just a seat of consumption and place where, people, maybe support each other and maybe have kids if they want, which is sort of the Western, or say the American view. Rather, it's a seat of business, a place where people not only raise the next generation, but care for their elders. And in these sorts of environments, sexual liberty has very, very different implications, right? So, trying to reshape and destroy family-oriented economic orders necessarily has engendered a lot of resistance around the world. And this is totally understandable, right? So, really, from probably 1993 onward, human rights discourse in terms of pushing the boundaries died. And it died specifically because the United States wanted to liberalize the world, and that failed very quickly. In human rights discourse, that failed almost immediately. Now, the thing is, you have another dynamic here that's really important, especially when we talk about sexual minorities and things like that, and that's that when a powerful country comes in and tells people what they have to do or what they can't do, right, that immediately engenders pushback, right? Nobody really likes to be told what to do, certainly not by somebody who they don't necessarily believe has their best interest in mind. And when you deal with power dynamics between countries, that's kind of the default, right? So, one of the very negative aspects of a lot of this is that you see, and you have seen, this pushback manifest in, ways that involve treating people who don't fit into sort of the gender reproductive aspects of society very well, right? And it's not that people don't know how to treat each other well or how to treat each other well over disagreement. It's that once you internationalize many of these problems, it becomes really easy to pick a scapegoat and say, hey, look, the gays are foreign agents, for example. And I've watched that dynamic quite a lot, especially in a few countries in Southeast Asia. And what people usually miss here is that sexual liberty, in the sense of destroying strong family orders as a basis for an economic order, is something which is pushed more heavily by Western corporations than it is by necessarily people living in those orders under any circumstance, right? And so a lot of this ends up being misdirected anger, and it's very destructive. So to a very large extent, what you've got is cases where we're going to liberate the gays from, Malaysian or Singaporean or Polish society, and that leads to an immediate backlash against the people that, the advocates wanted to help. And that's both very understandable and also very unfortunate. My view is that human rights discourse almost always, since the end of the Cold War, has been pretty destructive all across the board. And most people in most of the world understand that, which is why people don't really listen to a group like Amnesty International unless they have something to gain from a particular press release. And you see this in the United States too, right? If you compare Europe, where you don't have a fundamental right to, say, an abortion, for example, to the United States under Roe v. Wade, instead of being able to come together and talk about issues and life implications and things like that, the only conversation that was allowed in the United States was a life versus liberty argument along Lockean terms. And the problem with that then is that since life always trumps liberty, in Lockean terms, then either you have to attack Locke's hierarchy of rights, which some people do. They say liberty should trump life. I have a right to throw you out of my house even if it's going to mean you're going to freeze to death in 10 minutes. The more typical argument is, okay, well, when really does a right to life attach, right? And if that's your only way you can talk about a complex social issue, you have no hope of being able to come up with a social order that works better for everyone. So I believe that rights-based discourse, when rights are untethered from any foundation and are looked at primarily as self-evident rhetorical ideas, is necessarily a problem, because it means that all of our arguments end up being ones where we assume the conclusions, and therefore we can never ever agree, right? So human rights discourse has been in decline since the early 1990s. This was in decline during the golden years of global liberalism. And it's been continuing to be in decline, right? So this is a particular case where our approaches to the world following the Cold War should have alerted everybody to the fact that global liberalism wasn't going to happen. But, people will believe what they want to believe. But I would mention one thing here. When Amnesty International released their report critical of Ukraine and civilian casualties, the reaction I saw in Southeast Asia was pretty astounded. They said, look, Amnesty International is a westernizing organization. It's a pro-Western organization. For them to say anything at all negative about Ukraine is a major deal, right? The hundreds of pages that they had said critical of Russia, well, we kind of expect all of that because they're pro-Western organization, but these 4 pages, are a big deal because the bias of the organization, as it was seen in Southeast Asia, is so heavily obvious in that regard. And so what this means is we've never really had a consensus on human rights. All we've really had is a hegemon trying to enforce things. And the hegemon has continued to try to enforce things with heavier and heavier methods, indicating a lack of soft power. People aren't agreeing with the United States on all these things. And it's really important to recognize that just because a culture might not agree with the US in terms of, say, gay rights, doesn't mean you might not have some other methods of inclusion in society, but if they don't follow a rights framework, then they're not going to be counted by human rights organizations, right? So one thing I've watched in the time I was living in Indonesia was that you typically have a appreciation of contribution, which would allow people in sexual minorities to carve out places for themselves in society, oftentimes with a greater degree of agency and autonomy than you would typically find in a Western capitalist individualist society. And this is of course supported by the fact that you have this dramatic distribution of productive property, enabling people to have a much greater sense of control over their own economic lives. But again, it's not a rights framework, and so from Western perspectives, it doesn't count. And for this reason, you tend to see, human rights organizations as seen as entirely tone deaf by much of the world. So in conclusion, I want to point out a couple things. First of all, pushing human rights in controversial topics has almost always led to backlash and scapegoating of minorities that they were intended to help. Okay? The second thing is that following the end of the Cold War, a lot of Western institutions decided that obviously we know what's right. We're going to push our view of human rights on the rest of the world because it's self-evident to us and ought to be self-evident to everybody else. And there was no real check on cultural assumptions that go into these things, right? And consequently, there was a lot of pushback. You add those two together, and a very large number of the worst of the things that people look at in terms of human rights abuses were in fact caused by abuses of pushing human rights in the first place. So this is a discourse that needs to die, and needs to die fast, and needs to die very soon, because communities can come together and solve their problems. They're not going to do that when you have powerful foreign entities breathing down their necks. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Have a great day. Next time I will offer some conclusions to this series.